My name is Chris. I'm a poet, and I was one of the people invited to the founding collective meeting. I was kind of a Chisenhale bottle stopper, programmer, one of the regular programmers. You could say a kind of like a core demotic team, like doing all the everyday stuff. And finally a chair of the board in the late 80s, early 90s. I used to write reports, funding applications, all of that kind of stuff early on, before Ghislaine joined us. Designed leaflets. I was one of the 2 Tower Hamlets community dance workers with Mary Prestige, and did a lot of work in local arts politics, sitting on equal opportunities working parties, that kind of thing, liaising with, often with Mary and sometimes with Mary Prestige and Philip Jeck, local arts organizations, and working with children's organizations and so forth, all sorts of things like that.
What drew you to Chisenhale? Why did you end up there?
It was a time of arts collectives in London, the London Filmmakers Collective, the London Musicians Collective, housing for artists using available spaces, Acme space. It was a very interesting area in what I will broadly call like the East End at that point. There were also other organizations like Camera Work there. I'd been to X6 and I'd seen performances of at X6, and I'd also been involved as one of the performers in I, Giselle with Jackie Lansley and Fergus Early. But I was a poet who was working increasingly with gestures and spatial movement. I'd never thought of myself as a dancer, but was really interested in movement-based performance, the crossovers between performance, art, and dance. And I suppose I've written something down, I can say this. Everyone moves, everybody moves. And here was a collective opportunity to engage in serious play with movement and to find and acknowledge the materiality of the dance within movement. So I was really interested in collectives, collective politics, DIY culture, doing it yourself and doing it together. And I was really interested in this boundary between people who thought of themselves as dancers and people who thought of themselves as non-dancers, and how they could find common ground together and realize that those distinctions were not as hard and fast as they might have previously anticipated.
Brilliant. And so what was it like being an independent artist at that time, more broadly, but also what was the experience of working at Chisenhale as well?
I had been involved in a collective before that, which was called the Consortium of London Presses. We were based at the Poetry Society, as it was then, in Earl's Court Square. I ran a print shop there. I was a print shop manager, effectively, or that was my title. I taught people how to print, so poets, artists could come in and use the print shop and start their own presses and print their own books. It was punk. It was really all about punk. It was kind of like, you don't need all of the institutions, you don't need all of the funding bodies, you can do it yourself. I mean, I'm going to put a slightly cliche Marxist spin on it. Take control of the means of production. So I was really interested in that as a politics. I could, I had done a lot of performances as a musician at the London Musicians Collective. I've been involved in performances at the Filmmakers Co-op and so forth. I'm very much an in-between the interdisciplinarian. I have a visual arts practice, a sound arts practice, a writing practice. And yeah, I was fascinated by independent dancers cutting away from what at that time was a very kind of codified mainstream of how you become a dancer and what a dancer is and what a dancer looks like and what kind of training they've had and so forth. And I wanted to support that and be part of that since they had weirdly accepted me. I mean, you know, there was a kind of a bootstrap thing happening, which was that we found ourselves very differently from X6. We found ourselves immediately on a street where people live. And that profoundly affected everything that happened. It was like, you know, well, we can't just be these incomers who are doing this strange thing that never has any contact with the people who are living immediately here. We have to have a conversation with the people who are immediately here. So things like children's dance classes. And then kind of like, you know, through what Mary and I were up to, working with elderly people, working with people with different movement abilities. It really did become almost on one edge about a kind of a total health idea about the human body.
Responding to the environment, the local environment, and also the political one, you know, the cultural one, everything.
All of which was changing in the East End at that point too, dramatically. I mean, there was a kind of like a gentrification edge, but there was also an incredible mixture of different migrant, immigrant, refugee communities, but also older established communities from completely different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah. You've mentioned that you and Mary were both the community dance workers, the first two. I think that was 1984 that those two roles were established. How did you approach that role in the context of the practice that you were doing, new dance? How did you think about that work?
Okay, so if we turned up in a place, Mary was an established and accomplished, trained dancer, also with a gymnastic background. You know, she could say something like, well, I was at the Tokyo Olympics, which was like straight off the back gave some kind of credibility. And I was not a trained dancer. I interacted, by that point, I had been interacting with dancers. I did some very open improvised performances with Kirsty Simpson. I did performances with Michael Clark and company at Riverside. I'd had some sort of like tap dancing stuff through Sue McLennan, you know, but total scattershot of non-proper training. So I think there immediately you have that ethic of, so what can people who think of themselves as kind of trained dancers, and what can people who think of themselves as sort of ordinary people who don't have any dance training, what can they do together? I think we represented that a bit. There were things that we needed to do, like we were expected by Tower Hamlets Council to involve people. So we set about, and maybe it was slightly a little bit too clunky, we set about going and just meeting people. So we went to community centers, we went to schools, we went to places where there were kind of like craft classes or art classes or whatever, and said, well, how about doing something with dance? So a lot of it was about meetings and conversations and opportunities. We had a little bit of a working budget. And that is immediate, that opens doors. If you say to people, well, we could fund a children's dance class. Yeah. And maybe it's not just a children's dance class, maybe it's a dance class that they're doing with Shabana Jaya Singh. Those kinds of things. We brought popping and locking crews from New York, who did hip hop dance demonstrations and workshops. It really was a reaching out, outreach. and finding out who was there, who responded to us. And we did like, you know, dozens and dozens of those kinds of engagements and meetings. And then with those different places that responded in some way positively, and I can't remember anybody who ever said no, we would set up whatever it was that they wanted, pretty much. If it was a kind of an elderly person's tea dance, we'd have a go at it. We brought a trio from the Café de Paris at Leicester Square to come and play in York Hall, where they normally have boxing bouts. And people were bussed in from around the borough to waltz around and do foxtrots and all of that kind of stuff. So that kind of thing, it was, we just threw ourselves into it from every possible direction. And Mary was incredibly generous and open, which she is anyway, but she wasn't wanting to be like, I'm a dancer and you need to learn how to do contemporary dance or something like that. It was really whatever people wanted. It might be martial arts. So it might be you're going to have some Aikido workshops, or you're going to do Tai Chi. You know, that's what you want to do. And then the other thing we did, which I think was very interesting, was to mix up different groups on a kind of what I would call like a folk culture basis. So we'd go to, for example, a Chinese community center and a Turkish community center and a Sylheti community center. And we'd say, okay, like, you know, what we're going to do is have like, each of you are going to teach each other a dance, and you're each going to cook food, and you're each going to bring your music, but people would come from those different cultural backgrounds. And those were really interesting evenings. And it was about like, everybody has a dance, you know, like, we're not talking about kind of high culture now. We're talking about, you know, the disco, whatever, Saturday Night Fever. We're talking about people doing what was at that time kind of like pejoratively called belly dancing. But, you know, that was happening in people's council flats. So Egyptian dance and or learning these Greek steps, or that was fascinating. And it was kind of like, you know, let's forget about the politics. Let's forget about the fact that you're running away from a right-wing regime and you're running away from a left-wing regime. Let's look at the cultural place of music and dance and food and celebration. And so we'd do kind of like, you know, Eid events and things like that for the end of Ramadan. For me, that was almost the most interesting model. And once people start doing that and just start kind of giggling together, because like, oh crikey, how do you do that? Oh, you go that way round, and it, you know, so much ice got broken.
Yeah. And the model, I suppose, of doing that work sounds similar when you're talking about it to the collective working that was going on in Chisenhale, but just being sort of applied to the work that you were doing outside of Chisenhale as well. So just an extension really of the collective, but responding to what the community wanted, like you say, if it was a tea dance or if it was a Irish dancing or whatever it might have been.
Yes, it was all of those things. You know, it was, yes, the politics were really there. Really, Chisenhale, a second wave feminist politics. That was strongly present. Yes. And anti-patriarchal politics, kind of the problem with collectives, which is that you have these tensions between what is vertical in terms of decision making and what is horizontal in terms of decision making, what Deleuze and Guattari would call rhizomes and arbors, what Manuel de Landa calls the meshwork between the vertical and the horizontal, the meshwork between the arborescent and the rhizomatic, that kind of thing. That was very much in play. I experienced that dramatically at times. Collective meetings could go on for hours. and they could be attritional, which is that people had to leave because they had other commitments. And so they were, that's not good. But personally, I was committed to that politics, but now I understand and have experienced the downside of it too.
Yeah.
Maybe another way of saying this, I think Chisenhale became porous to the communities that it was embedded in. Mm. And it became context responsive and somewhat site specific. I mean, Mary and I were doing performances on the canals and things like that. It is a post-industrial space. That's interesting too. Mm. Art Place Trust was really galvanized into, I was on the board of Art Place Trust for quite a long while. And, it was all this amazing stuff with Rachael Whitered doing Ghost and Font Finats. I'm thinking about Cornelia Parker's incredible Exploded Garden Shed. All of those exhibitions were happening on that site too. So that's kind of like all part of what's in the air.
And because you talked about the other DIY, collective groups that were that were around at the time, and it's interesting the position that Chisenhale had in being porous to its context. It seems as though it was both part of a network of DIY collectives, but at the same time, it's part of a network of community groups or centres.
It was, yeah.
Which is really interesting, a really interesting position to hold and to navigate.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to this explicitly, but I'm fairly close enough with the histories of it. I don't think that the musician collective and the filmmakers collective, for example, had that much to do with, and actually they were in a very different kind of street. But they didn't have that much to do with people who were immediately around there, unless people who were immediately around there were musicians. They weren't offering kind of like programs of classes. Chisenhale had to in order to get funding. This was the kind of the weird flip.
But I suppose also, there's like you say, there's funding, but also what you were talking about at the beginning, everyone has a body and everyone has movement. And so I guess with musician collective and the film cooperative, equipment was needed and, relatively clunky and expensive equipment, but you could go out and anybody could start moving in a space, and you had space so people could come in and do that as well. So I suppose the form actually allowed you to do that maybe more so than others.
Somewhat. I mean, yes, the film people, they needed projectors, or they needed some way of kind of casting light. Yeah, and the musicians would bring their own instruments. There wasn't any kind of formal setup, the musician collective. But yes, it was just a space. Yeah. I mean, it's that thing that Dessertu talks about, the difference between space and place. Place is a practiced space. And the practice changed inside that space several times a day. It might be rehearsal, it might be children's classes, it might be a meeting, it might be a performance, it might be Charlie Atlas filming.
People often talk about collective activity at that time being countercultural. Would you have described Chisenhale as countercultural at that time?
I mean, I guess, yes, you would, but did I ever hear anybody use that word? No. Independent, I like, at that period of time, because it felt like there was people who had, many of them in different ways, experience of institutions, but had decided to do something for themselves. Greenham Common, maybe, is a part of this. Sarah Green, who was at X6, was very involved in Greenham. That sense of how you can collectively change something, a kind of collective momentum rather than and obviously collective momentums include personal journeys. That interface between the personal and the political. I liked a sense of independence because it was break away from somewhat the cultural stranglehold of the really big institutions, particularly in terms of dance. Like, what was there? You know, there was like the Royal Ballet and Ballet Rambert and maybe London Contemporary Dance, and I guess early on the Place, but that was really contemporary. What was there? There was nothing. So, you know, totally understandable if musicians are breaking away from a kind of like some of the institutional constraints around music. Filmmakers are beginning to do their own thing, and it's nothing to do with the filmmaking industry as such. Feminist photographers are banding together and saying, let's do something about body image. Joe Spence, like amazing people like that. I don't think it was really oppositional to what was there. It was just like, we're going to do something else.
Yeah.
For me, it was a punk connection, but I don't think that that was true for everybody at all. Although punk was in the air. It was like, there's all this empty property around London, and there was, that still had not been brought back into usage since almost the Second World War. There were bomb sites still at that time. You know, let's use this space.
I think what's interesting about Chisenhale as well, maybe not counterculture and being oppositional, but challenging, being independent from the mainstream and challenging lots of things that were going on there. I think what's interesting about it is it was not only that space, but you also had New Dance magazine, which was supporting that language of what was going on. And that relationship between having a magazine and also the necessity for having it and being this space is just really interesting, because it also demonstrates that what was being done there, like you say, wasn't being done anywhere else, and you needed to write about it.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously musics that came out of the London Musicians Collective, they were doing exactly the same thing. It's fantastic too. I mean, it's part of developing conversations around and ways of talking and vocabularies, but yeah, slightly more formally trying to work out how to talk about these activities, these events, these gatherings. That was an important part of it. Yeah, and you've reminded me of something that I had not mentioned in this at all, but there was for quite a long while, there was a really strong alliance with the dance festivals at Dartington. Everybody would go down to Dartington. Well, not everybody, but a lot of people went down to Dartington. What Mary Fulkerston was organizing down there. And I'm sure if you talk to other people that there were other kind of like centers. So there was this sense of putting together a puzzle or something, whittling something collectively. It was very organic. Maybe frustratingly so for some personalities. There were tensions between people who really, like fairly quickly, they just wanted to use the space to rehearse in, or to run their own workshops in. And then there were all sorts of conversations. It's like, we can't just present that our program is X did a workshop and made a piece of work here and performed here, and Y did a workshop and made a piece of work and performed here. We have to open this out. So, you know, what else can we be doing? We couldn't just ask, like, it didn't exist then, Starbucks to come and kind of like run a coffee bar inside Chisenhale. That's the conversation with Far Eye Foods. You know, we've got like whatever, one evening a week when there are going to be performances, and there might be 40, 50, 60, 20, who knows how many people around. You know, could you cater that? Yes, exactly. And then you're sort of thinking, well, there also needs to be something in it for them, other than just kind of like, you know, we're selling a whole bunch of couscous and salad and doing some smoothies and soft drinks or whatever. Actually, it would be nice to feel like there's an aspect of this place which is open to our cultural expression in dance and movement and so forth. I mean, all those conversations happen really fast. It's not difficult to say we were a bunch of white people.
Were you predominantly involved with the work that you were doing as a community dance worker, or was it equally about, you know, performing at nights in Chisenhale as well for you?
It wasn't about performing at night in Chisenhale for me. I might be, I don't know about other people. I feel like the core of the collective, and that's a kind of like an invidious distinction to make, but there were people who were around more than others, particularly early on, for all sorts of reasons. The core of the collective, we tried to downplay ourselves a bit, because we really saw the necessity of it being seen to be other people, lots of other people, as many as that we could possibly get involved. So no, it wasn't a place to show work for me at all. I really appreciated being able to be involved in workshops sometimes. Going to say that the basis early on of the workshops was contact improvisation. That was great. I don't remember any money ever being paid for anything. People just came to workshops. And there might be special inset things like Steve Paxton's going to be here for a weekend or whatever. But a lot of it was kind of jams. So I really liked that. It felt to me, I'm sure some other people would say this, that was a kind of democratizing form that dovetailed well with the ethics of Chisenhale. There were other ways too. So I really enjoyed just being able to get hot and sweaty with other bodies sometimes, and the whoosh of energy that would come out when sometimes we just all broke out and danced, not talking about like any kind of structure, just like, it's cold, let's dance, all of that kind of stuff. I really enjoyed and admired the fact that here was an art form where the majority of people who were taking it seriously and creating work were women. That was not the case in music at that time. It was not the case in poetry at that time. It was like, yes, there was camera work that was very important. But the fact that this was a discipline where women were at the forefront was very distinctive for me. I liked that politics. And then I was really interested in all of the issues around, as I've said a little bit before, dancers versus non-dancers, and how some of that began to kind of infuse itself into the mainstream. I'm thinking about like a company like Ballet de la Cé de la Baie in Belgium, where at that time anyway, I don't know if he's still doing that kind of work, there were often a lot of non-dancers. I'm thinking about kind of like the work that Mark Tompkins was doing in Paris. I'm thinking about where dance met performance art. That was very interesting. And I guess if I were to classify myself at that point, I might have slightly more said that I was an artist interested in performance than anything else. I never would say I was a dancer, even when I was in Chisenhale. No way. Hilariously kind of inept. But I think that like the intensity of my ineptitude sometimes made it compelling. although there was an experience that I had, which was nothing to do with Chisenhale, but it was the same period of time, which I loved, which is that Miranda Tufnell commissioned me to write a text, effectively, that was going to be the soundtrack that she and Dennis Greenwood danced to. And we did a tour of this. It happened, I mean, we did it in the Big Barn in Dartington. I can't remember. There was like a number of places that we did this. It was called Night Moves. We did it at Riverside Studios. And I sat on the stage and talked. They danced around. And we moved everything. We moved the kind of the furniture, we moved the lights. And I was mostly sitting, but would also move around the stage. And I think once or twice they also moved me. I don't mean like physically lifted me, but they kind of like would shunt me around. That was the one time when like my art form as a writer and a poet and dance really came together. And I one of the more profound experiences of my life. Well, the other one was I did with Michael Clark at Riverside, and that was hilarious. So Michael, I must have been sitting, I guess I was on a chair up amongst the lights for the first half of the performance. And then they let me down onto the stage and all the dancers went off to have an interval. And I did a kind of a weird interlude. And then I left the stage and they all came back on to dance for the second half of the evening. There was some kind of electronic soundtrack, but I improvised commentary to what I was seeing on the stage for the entirety of the second half of the evening, standing with a mic at the side of the stage. But yeah, that was improvised speech with Michael's company.
So my last question is, how would you describe what Chisenhale was at that time?
Embryonic. Sort of like, okay, these are all going to be terrible metaphors, like a Roman candle of prototypes, a fire around which multiple people interested in physical movement warmed themselves. A conversation about abilities, a profound conversation about abilities, I think. A sense of bonding around the idea that you can make something happen if you work on it together. Somewhat, and now I'm going to sound a bit dystopian, I think, somewhat an investigation of controls, where controls lie, who has them, where they come from, what other kind of systemic pressures are driving them. Genuinely open and anxious about being so. I mean, that's my experience. Somebody else might throw that in a different way. You know, and then all the other kind of tawdry cliches, like a sort of like a melting pot of influences and references, but definitely was a confluence or a nexus or a junction or a network. I like networks, a network flow of influences and references about the public and the private sphere, how bodies interact in kind of like public spaces, how bodies interact in more intimate, more private spaces and places, that kind of thing. Emergent, immanent, very organic, day to day, by the seat of its pants.
In some ways, the only thing that remained fixed was the building itself in that location on that street.
And the floor.
And the floor.
the floor was that. The floor was a grounding that enabled everything to happen. I firmly believe that. The space was kind of like, the space was there early on, really early on. It was about the floor, and it was slightly sprung, and it was seasoned 19th century maple. And the wall at the back of the space, I can't remember how many of us, 6, 8 people chipped away at the white paint on that wall. And we, every now and again we'd step back and say, is that enough? Is that too much? And then the fire escape. Those 3 things: the wall, the floor, the means of exit. What made it viable as a space that could get a performing arts license?
Yeah,
they're all super interesting in their own way.
Yeah.
And they figure in the photos, and they figure in the kind of the desperate mythology around raising the money for the fire escape. When you put this work on proscenium arts stages, you change the relationship between the spectator and the work. And one of the things that was, I never thought this before, one of the things that was really interesting about Chisenhale is that it was a flat space. It could be deconstructed really easily. Chairs could be put out on the space, which they sometimes were. Sometimes people did things in the round. Sometimes there were seats on 2 sides and just a big space in between. Yeah, I think infrastructure is super interesting. I mean, we built it. You were really close to the performers, the dancers. There was a kind of heat exchange between all of the bodies in the space. And it had an intimacy that I think is lost. Well, I know it's lost as soon as you put things onto these really big stages. There's an interesting politics. And there were lots of times at Chisenhale when there were kind of like circles or horseshoes or whatever, where the boundary between it's what happens when you put things in the round. You're watching other people watching it as much as you're watching the thing that you're watching. I think there's something really interesting there about the shift from X6 to Chisenhale is that both of them were effectively flat spaces. And they were both, in both of those spaces, you were very close to the performers. So you could feel stuff. When Mary Prestige lifted up a door and staggered across the space with a door that she could barely hold, it was visceral. It was embodied. And I think that what I liked about Chisenhale at that time was the embodiment was the core. And the embodiment, being in the same space, sharing those kind of resonances, those vibrations, those energies collectively, was an ethics and a politics. I mean, I think that's worth saying, is that we were sort of popping up in lots of different situations. And we had a marching band at Chisenhale too that Sianed and I got together, called Eat My Hat. And we would play, Mary played big bass drum in Eat My Hat. There were musicians from the Musicians Collective like Sylvia Hallett and Clive Bell and Stuart Jones. And Sianed and me, I think maybe Jessica Loeb. We did stuff in Victoria Park for huge demonstrations. And Yeah, there's some gorgeous photos of Mary and me and Sianed and Phil and Doug Gill and Sylvia Hallett and Jessica Loeb being the raft of the survivors in Limehouse Basin for the huge welfare state sinking of the Titanic performances. And we're on a raft. We built this enormous raft. So the welfare state thing, that's kind of like, you know, at that time, they were a huge theatre performance art troupe. And we were asked to be part of that. And then we were asked to be part of these community processions. And so we got this rough band together to do that. And yeah, that was all part of kind of mucking in with everything else that was going on. That's a nice way of saying it. As a collective, we took different forms to muck in with all of these other organizations and community groups and arts projects. It's amazing that it's still there. And it's really an extraordinary to have been part of something that carries on when you're no longer part of it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much.